On May 8, 1945, while in Berlin the German officers signed their final surrender and the last soldiers left their weapons on the ground, the Soviet leaders celebrated the end of a war that had left millions dead. The troops were already deep in the enemy capital, the buildings were reduced to rubble, and in Moscow they were preparing parades, speeches and medals. The cost was brutal, cities erased from the map, broken families, people disappeared without a trace. But those in power were still there, in clean uniforms with the face of a hero. They hadn't gotten muddy on the front lines, but their names were on every order, every repression and every execution. Over time, several fell. Some removed from power, others died peacefully at home, or ended up buried as if nothing had happened, but all left something more behind. Children, wives, grandchildren. Some tried to live their lives far away, others could never escape the weight of that last name. And what happened to them, to those who grew up carrying all that without having anything to do with it? The one who didn't let go of the last name. Irina was sitting at the back of the hall, unmoving, with a firm face and her gaze fixed, while people entered in a line with their heads down, as if they all knew they weren't just standing before the coffin of a former president, but before the last person from his family still standing. There were no parades, no anthems, no state honors as others had received. There was a sober room, a closed casket, a couple of discreet cameras, and her alone without tears or dramatic gestures, as if she had already lived it 1,000 times, even though it was the first. From the moment she had memory, Ena Vilganskaya knew that her last name was a burden. Not because anyone said so, but because it was clear in the silences, in the glances, in the measured steps of the people around her. She was the daughter of the man who ended up dismantling from the inside the system that had raised him. And that, in the Soviet Union, was anything but simple. Her childhood was austere, without showy luxuries, with a cultured mother, strict down to the last detail, and a father who lived more between meetings than at home. When the words perestroika and glasnost became part of the world's vocabulary, she was already a doctor, working in Moscow hospitals, managing as best she could to keep her routine, until that routine became impossible. They began to follow her, to take pictures of her, to ask her questions she didn't want to answer. They portrayed her as the exemplary daughter of the new socialism, the familiar face of change. But she never sought cameras, nor wanted interviews. She went where she was forced to, walking a few steps behind her mother or father, and stayed there, silent, as if she weren't even there. When the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin and the system completely collapsed, Irina didn't run, didn't go to another country, didn't use contacts to settle in. She stayed in Moscow in a regular apartment with her husband Anatoly Vagansky, a scientist who never wanted to know anything about public life, and their children, raised away from the spotlight, without pushing them into politics or the media. The oldest, Anatoly Jr., got into business, but without boasting, without showing off the last name. Irina, meanwhile, avoided being the center of anything. She remained firm, discreet, as if she erased herself deliberately from every scene. Everything changed with the death of Raisa, her mother, in 1999. The family balance came crashing down. Gorbachev was lost, directionless, and though he still attended events, traveled and gave speeches, he was no longer the same. That's when Irina took the helm. She left medicine, took charge of the daily routine, reorganized the Gorbachev Foundation, and without anyone asking began to speak for him, to respond for him, to take care of him. The office was her daily life. She arrived early, reviewed letters, organized documents, authorized publications, and sat in every meeting where it was necessary for the last name to be present. The place wasn't luxurious, but it was filled with papers that spoke of history, speeches, treaties, photos, letters. While other children of old leaders used their names to seek privileges or positions, she spent her time sorting papers. And as Gorbachev grew weaker, with pains, with vision problems, with his voice gradually fading, it was Irina who spoke, the one who responded, the one who accompanied him at every event, without seeking applause, without asking for recognition. She did it because it had to be done. For 2 decades there were no scandals, no controversies, no strange alliances. Irina stayed away from the spotlight. She only spoke when it was necessary to correct lies or defend her father from the campaigns that blamed him for everything that happened after the fall of the system. When the war in Ukraine began in 2022, it was she who said that her father couldn't sleep, that he didn't speak, that he watched the news as if everything he had tried to build had been destroyed. It was one of her last appearances. Then came the silence. Today, Irina still lives in Moscow. She spends her days among old papers, folders with documents, signed books and printed speeches. She meets with historians who want to see the archives, manages invitations, reviews, publications. She has no social media, doesn't appear on TV, and doesn't comment on Putin or the country's direction. She walks through the halls quietly, responds with short sentences, avoids being seen as the protagonist of anything. She never sold exclusives, didn't start businesses with the last name, didn't get into politics. She limited herself to guarding, to protecting, to holding on. Those who work with her say she knows every corner of the foundation by heart, that she can say which letter is missing, which visit was most important, which document shouldn't be touched. She reviews every loan, every exhibition, every file, and when asked if all that effort makes sense, she answers calmly, without drama. She says the last name is heavy, but not as punishment, rather as part of something that can't be left behind. Like a promise her mother made her repeat when she knew she was going to die, "Don't leave him alone." And she didn't. Svetlana, the woman who escaped the most feared last name of the century. Svetlana crossed the entrance of the American embassy in New Delhi as if she had been carrying that decision for years. It was March of 1967. She wore a light coat, a small purse, and had no documents on her, but she knew exactly what she was going to do. Desert. She hadn't told anyone. She had no accomplices, no passport, no guarantees, just a name that the diplomats didn't know how to handle. She was Svetlana, the daughter of Stalin, and she had decided that she would never return to the USSR. She was born in 1926 in the heart of Soviet power, surrounded by guards, advisors, silent hallways, and a father who never laughed. From a young age, she learned to stay quiet, to read the adults' looks, and to disappear from rooms when Stalin raised his voice. Her mother, Nadezhda, committed suicide when she was 6. It happened during an official dinner. No one explained anything to her. After that, her mother's name was banned. No one mentioned it, neither at home nor at the Central Committee. She grew up in a house that resembled more of a barracks than a home. There were servants, tutors and guards, but there was no freedom. Everything she said, everything she did was monitored. Her father would call her from time to time to give her dry orders and check on the completion of tasks. There were never any signs of affection, explanations or questions. When her uncles and acquaintances disappeared overnight, she understood what it meant. They were either dead, imprisoned, or in Siberia. No one said it, but she knew. While Stalin directed terror from the Kremlin, Svetlana lived amidst monitored luxury. She ate well, had special clothes, and attended good schools, but she also lived in fear. Every time someone was absent, she knew they had been erased from the map. She learned to simulate calmness, to pretend normality, even though inside she felt like everything was falling apart. She wrote diaries that she later burned in case anyone found them. When Stalin died in 1953, power disappeared abruptly. Svetlana was left alone, without bodyguards, without relevance, with a last name that no longer protected her, but weighed like a sentence. She tried to lead a normal life. She studied literature, worked as a translator, married several times, and had 3 children. One was sent to a military school without her consent. Another grew distant. The youngest was born many years later. She tried to leave the country multiple times, but the state denied her permission over and over again. Until in 1966, she traveled to India with an official delegation. That's when she found her opportunity. One day, out of the blue, alone without prior notice, she entered the American embassy and requested asylum. The diplomats didn't know whether it was a trap or a problem, but they listened to her. In less than 24 hours, she was on her way to Rome, then Switzerland, and soon after, to the United States. When she arrived in New York, the media exploded. She was Stalin's daughter, turned dissident. She spoke fluent English, had no money, and had left her children in Moscow. For a time, she was protected by federal agents. Then the press began to suffocate her. She published a book, 20 Letters to a Friend, where she told for the first time about life inside the Kremlin, her mother's suicide, the daily fear and loneliness. She had a moment of fame, but the fame passed. She ended up in small cities, moving from place to place with irregular jobs. She married again, had a daughter, and moved again. In the 80s, she briefly visited the USSR, but realized that she no longer belonged anywhere. In one country, she was the daughter of the dictator, in the other, the traitor. In neither was she welcomed. She spent her last years in Wisconsin in a modest house with her youngest daughter. She had no possessions, no visitors, no contact with her older children. Her life was a series of moves, silences, and fragile routines. She said that everything she touched broke. She had no homeland, no inheritance, no certainties, just loose papers, saved letters, and boxes of memories that she dragged from one house to another. She died in November of 2011 in a public hospital. She was 85 years old. There was no tribute, no state ceremony, no statements. She was cremated with no audience. Her remains never returned to Russia. No one spoke for her. Her name, which for years had meant power and fear, ended up as a brief line in the newspapers. Stalin's daughter dies in the United States. Molotov, the bureaucrat who never let go of his position. Molotov kept waking up at the same time, even after he was over 80, as if the schedules of the Central Committee had never erased themselves from his internal clock, and the first thing he did before talking to anyone or reviewing letters was dress as he had done all his life. A closed shirt, a jacket, a tight tie, and a fixed expression, as if he still had to enter a meeting room to discuss the country's direction. He hadn't held any position for over 20 years, had no assistants, no secretary, no bodyguard, no one waiting for him outside his house, but he continued behaving as if the Politburo were still functioning, and he had to take note of everything. He lived in a modest apartment in Moscow, without decorations, without visitors, with his wife Polina, the same one who had been purged alongside him, and who also knew perfectly well that there was no way to start over, but who still sat in the kitchen reading old reports, as if they still mattered. He had been expelled from the party in 1962 for opposing Khrushchev's reforms, without any public scandals or loud headlines, but with the clarity of a firm sentence. Overnight, he went from being the man who had negotiated with Hitler and Roosevelt to being a retiree without a platform, without an audience, and without an official history. No one sought him out, no one quoted him, and if someone recognized him on the street, they barely greeted him with a brief gesture out of respect or habit. He never complained. He went out for walks at hours that didn't coincide with those of government offices, walked through side streets with folded documents in his pocket, as if he were still waiting for someone to ask him about the last report. Sometimes a neighbor would greet him. He would respond with a sharp nod of his head and keep walking without showing any irritation or gratitude. For years, the only one who crossed that barrier was journalist Felix Chuev, who visited him regularly and sat with him for hours with a recorder on, while Molotov spoke as if no time had passed, as if the Cold War was still active and the party could still recover him. He remembered figures, exact phrases from meetings, details of treaties, names that no one used anymore. He showed no doubts. He admitted no mistakes. He never corrected a single line of what he had defended during Stalin's regime. He justified the purges with the same tone others used to talk about budgets. He mentioned the deaths as necessary elements, as accounts within a strategy. And every time Chuev tried to ask an uncomfortable question, he simply moved on to another topic, another memory, another summary. He never lost track of the conversation. In the 70s and 80s, when many former leaders had already retired to the shadows or tried to change their rhetoric, Molotov insisted that his expulsion had been a passing mistake. He wrote letters to the Central Committee, requested meetings, sent documents with ideological corrections, defended Marxism-Leninism as if it still could influence anything. He even wrote a complete essay, which no one read, on the doctrinal foundations of Soviet foreign policy. He lived with Polina in modest conditions, with a state pension, a personal library, a television to which they barely paid attention, and conversations that were more reconstructions of the past than real exchanges about the present. They spoke about China, Africa, the world's communist parties, as if they still received the same official newsletters. No one answered them, but they continued talking anyway. When Gorbachev began to rise within the party, Molotov believed that they would finally rehabilitate him. He sent more letters, insisted with new arguments, requested that his party card be returned. He wasn't asking for a position, he wasn't asking for visibility. He was asking to exist again within the party. He said he had been loyal, that he had never deviated, that he had never betrayed the principles. For many, he was a vestige of the past, a piece that no longer fit into any structure, but he saw himself as a disciplined soldier still waiting for the right order. In 1984, he was readmitted without ceremony, without a press release, without a speech. It was an administrative decision, a way to close the door with elegance. That was enough for him. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't thank anyone. He simply put the new card in the drawer of his desk and returned to sit in front of his papers. A year later, his health began to deteriorate. He continued receiving Chuev, continued talking as always, but with longer pauses, with less strength, with silences that hadn't been there before. His memory responded, but his body no longer did. He died in 1986 in Moscow, at the age of 96. There was no state funeral, no speeches, no queues of citizens or flowers from the Kremlin. He was buried in Novodevichy, alongside other important names, but without any marks identifying him as what he had been. His tomb has his name, his title, and nothing more. It doesn't say that he signed pacts with Hitler. It doesn't say that he endorsed mass executions. It doesn't say that he was one of the central pieces of the harshest Soviet apparatus. It doesn't even say that until his last day, he acted as if all of that had been worth it, because he never stopped writing reports, correcting speeches, talking about the party as if it was still alive. He never apologized. He never changed his mind. He never acknowledged that time had already left him behind. The remains of the Brezhnev Empire decay without legacy. At 8:30 in the morning, the bodyguard knocked on the door as he did every day, waited a few seconds without receiving a response, and pushed the handle without announcing himself, following the same routine but with an unease that could no longer be concealed. Brezhnev was lying on his back, motionless, with purple lips and his eyes half open. They tried to use the portable defibrillator, but the device failed on the first attempt, and by the time the doctors arrived at the dacha, there was nothing left to do. At 9:30, the official cables confirmed the news. The General Secretary had died. There was no drama in the announcement. No details were provided. Just a short sentence informing the world that the leader of the Soviet Union had left his position for the last time. During his final years, Brezhnev's body had become a machine that barely responded. He walked slowly, his feet dragging on the carpet and his arms supported by assistants who helped him keep from collapsing in public. His tongue was swollen, his eyelids drooped, his jaw was rigid, and his breathing required more and more effort. He spoke in a low voice, with clumsy phrases that no one corrected, and signed documents that others had written. Despite this, he still appeared at all official events, dressed in heavy suits, his face made up for hours, his eyebrows fixed in place, and his face covered with layers of powder trying to mask the visible decay. In the Kremlin, everyone knew he no longer made decisions, but no one dared remove him from office. The balance had to be maintained until the last day. In his circle, everything was also falling apart. Galina, his daughter, had disappeared from family meetings long ago. Security reports detailed arrests for hotel scandals, relationships with illegal jewelers, and drunken binges that ended in psychiatric clinics. She had fought with half the Central Committee and earned the rejection of many who had once respected her only because of her last name. She would lock herself in her apartment for weeks, without seeing anyone, without answering calls. Her son Yuri, on the other hand, kept a low profile. He worked at the Ministry of Foreign Trade, without standing out, without making noise. After his father's death, he tried to distance himself from the public eye, but he didn't fully succeed. In the 90s, he appeared in investigations for corruption, although he was never prosecuted. He ended up in Switzerland without a position, without wealth, and with no desire to fight for a legacy that no longer served. His wife, Victoria, spent the following years as though she were under the watch of an invisible fence. The Central Committee withdrew her benefits, prohibited her from speaking to the press, and placed surveillance on her street. Sometimes they would allow her to visit her husband's grave in the Kremlin, but always escorted. She kept a box at home with Leonid's medals, convinced that was all she had left. The more visible decorations had been removed and returned to the state. Her husband's image began to disappear from books, school manuals, and the walls of official buildings. His figure was gradually becoming part of the uncomfortable past that no one wanted to remember. During the funeral, the body was displayed with heavy makeup, flowers arranged to the millimeter, and a setup that said nothing. The party leaders surrounded it in silence, with neutral faces and hands crossed. There were no tears, no visible emotion. Andropov took the floor with a cold speech, written by someone else, read with the precision of one who knows the goal is not to pay tribute, but to ensure continuity. No one mentioned the deterioration, the months of confusion, the silences, the forgetfulness. No one mentioned the decay. He was buried like a general, with automatic honors. Because the important thing was that the system didn't break before its time. After his death, Brezhnev's figure lost all its shine. What had been a symbol of stability for years became a caricature. Television programs began to air imitations showing him asleep, mumbling speeches, repeating meaningless phrases. Comedians used him as an image of stagnation. His name disappeared from streets, schools, and statues. Even the city that had been renamed in his honor recovered its original name. His face, which had once adorned banknotes and posters, was pushed to the back of a museum without a label. No one spoke of him aloud anymore, only as an example of what should never happen again. Galina spent her final days between hospitalizations, psychiatric clinics, and sporadic visits from bureaucrats who, rather than comforting her, controlled her. She died without any news in the newspapers, without official flowers, without recognition. Yuri continued living abroad, without interviews, without scandals, without a visible past. Victoria, the widow, lived a little longer, confined between old portraits, with the TV on all day, and without receiving invitations to any official events. For the country's history, the Brezhnev family was reduced to a secondary note, a brief mention, a caption in textbooks. For over a decade, Leonid Brezhnev had been the face of Soviet power. He appeared in factories, mines, parades, agricultural fairs. He had so many medals on his chest that it was hard to count them. He read endless speeches that few remembered, signed decrees that others wrote, and smiled with difficulty at every camera. But in his last years, there was almost nothing left of that. Only a decaying body, an unstable daughter, a directionless son, and an ignored wife. When the doctors took him out of the dacha that morning, there was no ceremony, no protocol, just a dry instruction: take him to the Kremlin. That's how the cycle was closed, without words, without legacy, without inheritance. Nena Krueva, the granddaughter who preferred teaching over giving speeches. Nena pushes the door of her office with the same confidence with which she has moved through the halls of the New School for years, a private university in New York where she teaches international politics without raising her voice or seeking attention. The students respect her for her work, for her clear way of explaining global conflicts, and for her rigor with sources. Some have heard her last name before and wonder if it has anything to do with that Soviet leader from the last century, but not many dare to ask. When someone does, she answers bluntly, "Yes, I'm the granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev." Her grandfather was one of the heaviest names of the Soviet century. He governed after Stalin, denounced the crimes of the regime, opened the camps, eased tensions with the West, and stood on the brink of nuclear conflict over the missile crisis in Cuba. Western newspapers portrayed him as an impulsive man, famous for banging his shoe at the UN, and at home he was remembered as a grandfather who spoke loudly, planted corn, and didn't avoid arguments. He liked eating at home, didn't trust official banquets, and had a family that didn't live in luxury. Among his children was Yulia, Nena's mother, who always stayed out of the public eye, away from politics and the chronicles that turned the Khrushchev name into a symbol of both rupture and reform. From a young age, Nena was interested in language, the nuances between languages, and how narratives can shape a country's image. She studied comparative literature, learned several languages, and completed her doctorate at Princeton, already settled in the United States, where she had come after spending part of her childhood in Moscow. At that time, having that last name didn't open doors. Quite the opposite. She didn't seek scholarships because of her origin, nor did she take advantage of any contacts. She simply studied, worked, published, and when her education was finished, she decided to stay in the US, teach, and build her own path away from the labels. In her early years as a professor, she took on smaller courses, wrote academic articles on foreign policy, analyzed official speeches, and started building a career slowly but steadily. She never used her last name as a calling card, nor as a shield. In her classes, she focused on data, sources, and documents. Sometimes someone would mention Cuba or Berlin, and she would cite her grandfather as a direct reference, but without nostalgia, without making it a personal story. He was a historical figure, not a family myth. Over time, she began publishing books. The first was a study on how American media represented Russia after the Cold War. Then came broader essays analyzing Putin's figure, propaganda strategies, 21st century authoritarian leadership, and how the Soviet legacy still shaped international politics. She didn't write from resentment or activism. She wrote with files in hand, with verified interviews, classified documents, and annotated speeches. This caught the attention of international media. She was invited to interviews, roundtable discussions, and talks at universities in Europe, Latin America, and Asia. She gladly accepted, but always imposed her rules. No tributes, no family biography, no turning history into a spectacle. In her Manhattan apartment, there are books everywhere, newspaper clippings ordered by date, old photos, and a folder with private correspondence. She has a black and white photo of her grandfather laughing with an ear of corn in his hand during a trip to the countryside. But she doesn't hang it up. She keeps it with other family photos, without visible frames. There are no medals, no busts, no Kremlin symbols, nor official mementos. Only folders, marked texts, notebooks with notes, and a mug with the map of the Soviet Union, which she sometimes uses to explain borders or migrations in class. Her students know her as a professor, not as the granddaughter of anyone. They respect her for how she dismantles arguments, for her clarity, and for her firmness without arrogance. She avoids social media, doesn't appear on sensationalist programs, and doesn't comment on Russian matters provocatively. She speaks when she needs to, she explains. She documents. She points out dates. She contrasts sources. She believes in evidence, not labels. In her free time, she walks through the park, reads in cafes, answers academic emails, and maintains a calm routine without needing to justify where she comes from or where she's going. Sometimes she receives letters from Russia. Some are from nostalgic people from the Khrushchev era, others from people who want to understand better what happened in those years. She reads them all. She responds to some, especially those from older people who lived through the changes of that time and now want to tell their side. She says those stories matter too. She holds no office, doesn't belong to any party, and doesn't represent anyone. She lives as an ordinary citizen, as a professor, as a researcher. She never asked for favors from the Russian state. She was never invited to official events, and she never expected to be. Today, her name appears in articles, essays, and conferences, but not as a descendant, as an author, as an analyst, as a professor who studies how countries' images are built and how the past infiltrates every discourse of the present. On her desk, next to her computer, there's a notebook with dates, a stack of texts to correct, and a folder with class materials. Sometimes, while giving an explanation about Soviet history, a student asks her if she has ever been in the Kremlin. She smiles, pauses, and replies that yes, she was there a long time ago. And she continues with the class, as if it were nothing. Alexander Berdonsky, the director who erased Stalin from his life. Every morning, Alexander walked the same route to the Russian Army theater, wrapped in his worn scarf, with his clipboard under his arm, and that serious expression his colleagues had always known. He didn't need identification or special greetings. He was the director, the one with the precise gaze and exact rhythm, the one who would repeat a scene 10 times if necessary, but never raised his voice. At the theater, they knew that his real last name wasn't listed anywhere. He had signed his first papers as Alexander Berdonsky, using his mother's last name, and since then, not once did he ever say out loud that he was born Alexander Vasilyevich Stalin, son of General Vasily Stalin, and the direct grandson of the leader who had ruled Soviet Russia with an iron fist for half a century. In Moscow, among colleagues, no one spoke of the matter. They knew him as Sasha, the one who didn't accept interviews, the one who didn't attend awards, the one who corrected with handwritten notes anything that didn't fit on stage. It was clear that he had made a decision early on, to bury the last name that others would have turned into a kind of shield. What for many was an inheritance, for him was a burden, and he left it behind like someone deciding to cut a dangerous wire without telling anyone. His childhood was a chaos controlled by silences. He grew up in a house where his father alternated between yelling, absences, and tantrums. After Iosif Stalin's death, Vasily was purged, accused, erased from public life, and with him his son was dragged into a life of moving houses, homes that didn't last more than a few months, tutors coming and going, and a stepmother who would beat Alexander when no one was looking. His biological mother wasn't there. She never came back. What little he remembered of her were scattered images, no full conversations. At 7, he was taken from that house without warning or farewells and sent to a family that didn't know whether to receive him as punishment or protection. No one explained anything. What he understood was that his last name was something he shouldn't pronounce. At school, while the others recited patriotic verses, he learned to read the adult gestures that said more than words, to detect when a sentence was dangerous, and to stay silent when the topic turned to his family tree. The name Stalin was no longer just a word. It was an alarm. The theatre appeared as a refuge. He didn't need lineage, just discipline, patience, and an ear. Alexander trained by copying the greats, writing down every turn of a scene, every effective pause, every movement that changed the tone of a play without breaking it. He never improvised. He repeated. He rehearsed. He polished. He obsessed over making everything flow, not for aesthetic perfectionism, but because he couldn't stand anything that sounded forced. When he started directing officially, he chose complicated texts, stories with broken characters, plays where no one was a hero or a victim. He liked long silences, small gestures, wounds that were never named but were visible. Some said his plays were too dense, others said they left no room for error. He didn't argue, he just corrected. The only exception to this silence was his relationship with Svetlana Stalina, his aunt, the dictator's daughter, who had also escaped the last name. They walked together through little-known streets, talked about books, childhood, and how memories distort everything. They never mentioned Iosif. There was no need. In that shared muteness was everything they didn't want to explain. At the theatre, his assistants knew that if a scene didn't work, Alexander would sit in silence, remain still for a while, and then ask for a repeat without altering his voice. Sometimes he would leave exact notes: lower the light by 2 points, pause before the sigh, move the chair 3 steps to the left. He never said something was wrong, he simply adjusted it. He also didn't allow tributes or events in his name. When someone tried to link him with his grandfather's figure, his response was dry, brief, definitive. On one occasion, a journalist asked if he felt proud of where he came from. Alexander lowered his gaze, said that it had nothing to do with him, and walked away without adding anything more. He lived alone, without assistance, without a driver, without tributes hanging on the wall. He had books, marked scripts, rehearsal recordings, and a recorder with which he reviewed dialogues as if he were learning to breathe again. If in conversation someone mentioned Stalin, he would say nothing. He waited for the topic to fade away on its own, not out of resentment but for self-defense. He had learned to survive without exposing himself. He died in 2017 at the age of 75. The news passed through some theatrical media, some colleagues wrote a short note, and a couple of theatres revisited his recordings. There were no speeches, no official wreaths, no public events. He was buried without pomp, accompanied only by those who shared with him stages, rehearsals, and coffees without headlines. His gravestone doesn't bear the word Stalin, only his chosen name, Alexander Berdonsky, theatre director. Nothing more. What he left behind is not in history books or family archives. It's in the productions still remembered in theatre halls, in the notes his assistants keep like maps, in the recorded rehearsals where voices break exactly at the moment he wanted. He didn't want to reclaim anyone. He didn't want to erase anything. He only chose to live without letting the last name crush him. And he succeeded. Ena Gorbacheva, the doctor who took care of her father until the end. Irina left the hospital without saying a word, papers in hand, her gaze fixed on the floor. They had just completed another checkup for Raisa, her mother, and although the report wasn't the worst, they were already talking about continuous treatments and prolonged cycles. It was 1998, and for months everything had revolved around those medical reports arriving from Germany every week. Mikhail Gorbachev continued with his travels, interviews, and conferences. But Irina took care of everything else, from the transfers to the schedules. No one asked her to. She did it because she knew how everything worked from the inside, because she knew the hospitals and knew which doors to knock on without getting stuck in bureaucracy. She had studied medicine, trained in endocrinology, and had been working between clinics, universities, and shifts for years. She never sought the spotlight. She didn't give interviews, didn't attend official events, didn't speak to the media. While many leaders' daughters settled into public positions, she preferred to stick to her routine of shifts and classes. She had married young, had 2 daughters, Ksenia and Anastasia, and led a quiet, organized life without surprises. Sometimes her father would call her to review reports, translate a text, or help with the agenda. She did it without cameras, without photos, without protocol, and she returned to her routine as if nothing had happened. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Irina was one of the few who stayed close, not as a political figure, but as part of his inner circle. They spoke with trust. Sometimes they would review past decisions without reproach. He would explain what had been behind certain reforms. She would listen, ask questions, correct names, highlight headlines in the newspapers, cut out articles. She also managed calls, organized visits, and responded to the endless letters that came in. When Raisa was diagnosed with leukemia, Irina took over everything. She took her mother to specialized clinics, sought opinions from different teams, organized medications, and reviewed every protocol. She slept on a folding bed inside the hospital, spent nights reading studies, and taking notes on details that might be useful later. Gorbachev was exhausted. He went out only when necessary, spoke little. Irina covered everything practical, emotional, and logistical. When Raisa passed away, it was Irina who organized everything. The transfer, the clothes, the paperwork, the flowers, without drama, without speeches, as if she had done it 1,000 times. Over time, the Gorbachev Foundation became her new routine. She didn't have a grand title. She was the vice president, but in reality, she was the one who opened the office, reviewed emails, archived documents, corrected texts, and coordinated meetings. She didn't occupy the spotlight, but she was behind every event, every conference, every foreign contact. On a trip to Italy, she organized the entire agenda with a precision that the organizers still remember. While her father was receiving awards and giving speeches, Irina made sure everything went as it should. At home, there were no medals, no busts, no official portraits hanging. She kept family photos, a notebook with Raisa's notes, and a copy of the diary of Anne Frank, filled with annotations. Ksenia, her eldest daughter, worked in the cultural sector. Anastasia, the youngest, was an architect. Neither used the last name as a passport. Irina had made it clear to them from a young age that while the last name might weigh heavily, it was no ticket to open doors without consequences. In 2011, during the tribute for her father's 80th birthday, Irina spoke publicly for the first time. She didn't have any papers. She thanked those present, reminded them that the name Gorbachev generated as much respect as discomfort, and asked that the history of the 20th century be read without applause or condemnation. There was no long ovation. She wasn't expecting one. In the following years, she continued as always. Sometimes she was invited to events about health or civil rights. If she accepted, it was to talk about what she knew: management, care, archiving, not politics. She never sought a position. She didn't accept party proposals. She never wanted to head anything. She would go, speak, and return. When Gorbachev began to deteriorate, Irina repeated what she had done with her mother. She prepared medical reports, organized visits, spoke with Russian and foreign doctors. During the last month, she was always close by. She spoke little, only responded when he asked. She continued taking notes in the same notebook. When he passed away, it was she who signed the papers, who organized the farewell, who received the visitors. Today, she still lives in Moscow. She handles matters of the foundation, responds to historians' inquiries, reviews manuscripts, and preserves archives. She doesn't appear on television, doesn't participate in debates, and doesn't make statements about the government or current events. She keeps the office just as it was, with the books in the same order and the documents classified. In one of the drawers, there's a handwritten letter from Gorbachev addressed to her. Irina read it once. She hasn't shown it, and she doesn't plan to. Tatiana Yumasheva, the strategist who wrote the last sentence of the Soviet century. Tatiana entered the Kremlin without showing any credentials, crossing the hallways as if they were part of her own home, and not stopping to greet anyone because everyone already knew who she was. There was no need to introduce her or announce her presence. She carried a small purse, a notebook full of notes, and the phone that rang every time her father needed something. Since the mid-90s, her role had no official rank or desk plaque, but she was everywhere. In meetings, in decisions, in the corrections of the speeches her father would later read in public as if they were his own. She didn't appear in the government structure, didn't feature in any organizational charts, didn't speak to the press, but ministers and advisors consulted her as if she were the chief of staff. During the '96 campaign, when the polls were at rock bottom and President Yeltsin seemed closer to resigning than winning, it was she who held the entire plan together. She gathered advisors, brought in image consultants, validated the phrases for the new speech, and organized the strategy to present her father as the only barrier to the return of communism. Everything passed through her hands. She didn't sign anything, but all the important things ended up being reviewed by her. After the elections, her role became less silent. She didn't change her status or ask for recognition. She simply kept working. She coordinated with ministers, spoke with businessmen, sat with media executives, and decided the schedules, audiences, and messages. Her connection with Boris Berezovsky was decisive for controlling the TV channels, and her trust in Anatoly Chubais allowed the definition of new positions within the government without provoking internal conflicts. She reviewed files, marked paragraphs, crossed out lines, corrected dates, all from her phone. She didn't give orders, but no one dared disobey her suggestions. When Yeltsin's health began to seriously deteriorate during the 1998 economic crisis, it was Tatiana who took charge of everything. She had the medical numbers written down in a notebook, knew the blood pressure levels, treatments, contraindications, and critical dates. She controlled the calendar to avoid scheduling meetings on days her father could barely stand. During the toughest weeks, she slept in the Kremlin, in an improvised room next to the presidential office, just to ensure no information leaked. Amid all this, she married Valentin Yumashev, a journalist who knew the halls of power as well as she did. He had been a speechwriter, then chief of staff, and finally became the informal link between the presidency and the media. Together, they were the hardcore making decisions when the president wasn't able to. Ministers referred to them as the family, without sarcasm. They coordinated with oligarchs, wrote responses, analyzed internal moves, negotiated positions. No one could make a move without informing them first. In 1999, as the end of Yeltsin's term approached and it became clear he wouldn't finish his presidency with strength, Tatiana was directly involved in choosing his successor. They discarded several names before landing on one few new, Vladimir Putin. He had experience, came from the security circle, had passed through St. Petersburg, and didn't raise suspicions among the more conservative groups. Tatiana found him the most controllable option. She participated in preparing the announcement, read the drafts, adjusted the phrasing. Every line Yeltsin would later read in public first passed through her notebook. On December 31st of that year, Yeltsin stood up with the most important text of his life in front of the camera. The message marking his exit from power was already written. Tatiana had reviewed it the night before, word by word. Just before the recording, she adjusted his jacket, pointed out the key points, and told him to read slowly. Then she left, stayed by the monitor, and when it was all over, she turned off the device and asked for the video to be sent directly to the state channel. That was how the presidency ended. After the resignation, they moved to the outskirts of Moscow, a quiet house without constant visits. For a while, Putin called them, invited them to protocol events and maintained courtesy. But the contacts began to dwindle. Tatiana stopped attending meetings, didn't take on positions, and didn't accept commissions. She dedicated herself to her daughter, her father's archive, and books. Her husband also distanced himself from the government until, in 2022, he cut all official collaboration. In the following years, she wrote a few articles, answered specific interview requests, and participated in forums on political memory. She defended what they had done, explained the decisions, acknowledged there were mistakes but didn't regret them. She said her role hadn't been sought, that she had been there because no one else could do that work. She responded bluntly when asked about the oligarchs, the privatizations, the internal wars. She didn't excuse them. She simply explained the context. Today she still lives in Moscow. She doesn't appear on television, isn't part of the government, and doesn't comment on current affairs. She keeps the Yeltsin Foundation running, organizes talks about the transition, cares for her father's personal archive, and stays in touch with some European politicians from the time. On her desk, she keeps handwritten letters from Yeltsin, some photos, and a blue folder containing the first draft of the resignation speech, the one she wrote with her father that winter morning. It's still there, folded, without a date, and no one else has seen it. Kriya Evans, Stalin's granddaughter. Kriya entered the store with her backpack slung over her shoulder, quickly greeted the owner, and went straight to the back where the unopened boxes were. It was just another job, nothing flashy, but it helped pay for her courses and gave her a routine. In this crafts store in the western United States, Stalin's granddaughter passed unnoticed. No one looked at her twice, not the customers, nor the suppliers, nor the curious onlookers who, years earlier, had still searched for clues about her mother. She spoke little, used her current name, and didn't offer any clarifications. Kriya Evans, that's how she was listed. She had been born in 1971 in California, the daughter of Svetlana Stalina and architect Wesley Peters. From the beginning, she had used different last names. Her childhood was a mix of Soviet and American, without stable roots. Her mother had escaped the world's most hermetic regime, and her father belonged to the political family of Frank Lloyd Wright. Amidst all this, Kriya grew up with a character hard to define, a voice that took time to assert, and a life that was redrawn every time her mother felt the need to start over. During the early years, they lived in several cities, with limited resources and chaotic schedules. She went to Catholic schools without being baptized. From an early age, she felt the distance from the others. It showed in the looks, the gestures, the teachers who would take her out of the classroom during ceremonies. At Stewart School in New Jersey, it became more pronounced. Alongside a Polish girl and a Jewish one, they formed a separate group. Their participation was restricted, different rules were imposed on them, and they were reminded they didn't fully belong. When Kriya asked if she could convert to Catholicism, her mother told her she was already baptized in the Russian Orthodox Church and didn't need to do it again. Soon after, Kriya announced that she wanted to stop being called Olga. From that day on, no one used that name with her again. Living with her mother was never easy. Svetlana had left behind an entire country, but she remained strict, obsessive, and inflexible. She didn't shout, but she imposed her will with a firmness that filled the house. Kriya, on the other hand, was impulsive, sensitive, freer. Once, at 10 years old, she left a note in the kitchen and walked to the bus station. She wrote to her mother asking her to meet her there because she needed to leave. Svetlana went out to find her wearing her housecoat, disheveled and barefoot. A neighbor found her buying a notebook and took her back. She returned with a bouquet of flowers and apologized. She never ran away again, but she shut herself off inside. She spoke little. She withdrew into her thoughts and stopped sharing what she felt. She finished school without interest in prestigious universities. She rejected Princeton, dismissed everything her mother considered important. She signed up for loose courses: design, accounting, business management. Nothing long, nothing glamorous. She sought independence, but without exposure. They lived for a while in Spring Green, Wisconsin, near Taliesin. A house surrounded by trees, silent, perfect for Svetlana. For Kriya, though, it was just another phase. She worked in stores, supermarkets, community centers, modest jobs with clear hours, no strange phone calls, no questions about the past. Then she moved from city to city. She passed through New York, small Midwestern towns, places where no one recognized her. Sometimes she used Peters, sometimes Evans, always making sure no one associated her with Stalina or Stalin. In a conversation with a friend, she mentioned that during her adolescence, she didn't know who her grandfather was. She had heard the name, seen it in books or news reports, but didn't connect it with her personal story. Her mother rarely mentioned the past, and when she did, it was with brief, unemotional phrases. The last years together were the most tense. Svetlana was accumulating health problems, becoming more anxious, more unpredictable. Kriya tried to maintain a stable routine. She had a partner, a quiet job, organized hours. She helped when necessary, but preferred to stay on the sidelines. When her mother died in 2011, she arranged only what was needed. She received the ashes, retreated to her home, and kept the urn without notes, frames, or labels. The memory stayed contained, out of sight. Today, she still lives in the United States. She has technical studies in administration, runs small businesses, avoids politics, and doesn't appear in public forums. No documentaries have been made about her, and no signed memoirs circulate. There are few photos of her on the internet. Those who have seen her describe her with a serious gaze, sober gestures, and a calm demeanor that deactivates any curiosity. When someone mentions the last name Stalin in conversation, she changes the subject without urgency. While other heirs of historical figures chose visibility, positions, or platforms, Kriya moved in the opposite direction. She changed her name, her city, and her profession. She faded without conflict. In official documents, she no longer appears as Svetlana's daughter. In searches, only a few traces remain. Her story ended up buried between moves, ordinary jobs, and a personal decision she made as a child, to live without anyone being able to track her. There is no manual for being born with a last name that drags so much history behind it, nor an easy way to grow up knowing that what you did or didn't do will never matter as much as where you come from. Because when you're born into a family that's been involved in the heaviest places of power, it doesn't matter if you decide to leave, stay silent, work in the shadows, or simply live like anyone else. There will always be someone who looks at you strangely, asks you an uncomfortable question, or reminds you of what you didn't even live through. And even though many tried to follow their path without scandals or speeches, the truth is that past doesn't fade, doesn't hide, and doesn't let go. It stays there like an invisible mark that accompanies you in every decision, every crossroad, in everything you do or decide not to do. And so in the end, the most surprising thing isn't what they did with the power they never asked for, but how they managed to live carrying everything they were left with without having been able to choose any of it.